Hello, everybody. Welcome to EdinburghJS and welcome to CodeClan. New venue for us this time. Hopefully it'll be a more social kind of space for us to hang out, eat pizza, drink beer, and chat about JavaScript. A few things just like kind of health and safety wise. If the fire alarm goes off, go out the door you came in. No smoking, no vaping. I'm going to look to Morag. That was everything that you asked me to say? Yes. There's a first aider on site. Yeah. Cool. Toilets are out round the back in the at the end of the long corridor out there if anybody needs them. Beer and pizza, please do help yourself. We had a little QR code just on your way in with a little survey. We're dead keen to hear from people, just either ideas for talks, things you'd like to hear about, things we can do for you. And also, if there are any more vegans here, please do let me know things like that, because I order one vegan pizza, but maybe we've got some people who aren't vegans who find vegan pizza very tasty. Yep. So just let me know stuff like that, and then we can make the event as good as possible for everybody that wants to turn up. So I thought I'd also kick off tonight with a few job announcements. Some people have been messaging me about things. So Stefan is recruiting experienced front-end developer, JS and TS, framework experience and leadership ambitions for a hybrid role at a technology company based out of Glasgow. He's also recruiting a project manager ideally with a digital agency background. So if that sounds like you or someone you know, I can put you in touch with Stefan. I will share a link on the Twitter and in our Discord to his LinkedIn profile, and you can ask him for more details. And Siwei, you also had a job that you wanted to chat about.
Hey guys, so my name is Siwei. I'm the CTO of a startup called Spectinga. We are a second-hand tractor marketplace. So we sell tractors overseas to Europe and America. And we're currently hiring mid-range to senior full-stack engineer. Our current stack is in React and Python, but we're not super attached to it. And we're just looking for people who are willing to learn the startup vibe. We're based in Edinburgh, have a really cool office, and we can offer competitive salary and options. So if you want to get in touch, just talk to me, and then I'll probably share the link later as well. Thanks.
Cool. We'll put all these links in Discord. If you have any jobs that you know about or are looking for a job, try and message me or post in the Discord, and we will try and connect people to each other. Cool. So the first talk, I'm looking over at Diego to see if he's finished his slides. It's from Diego. There's some coding going on at the end, I think. So cool. Diego's going to be talking about testing services with Pact. So please, Diego, take it away.
How do I plug in? The other side. Should have tried this before. Well, does it work? Does it work? Getting there? Yep. Awesome. Cool. Awesome. So I'll talk about contract testing with Pact. So I think when I gave the title of the talk, I was in a rush trying to do some stuff for work, and I was like, I just need to reply to this. So I just said, testing microservices with Pact, which is fine. So I'll talk a little bit about myself because you have to do it. I don't like it, but whatever. So my name is Diego. I am originally from Guatemala. Guatemala is a tiny country beside Mexico and Belize. It's quite nice, actually. I love volcanoes and coffee and rum and cigars. It's great. I love it. I studied in Sydney when I left home, and then I moved to Scotland in 2009. I've been here since. I currently work for FanDuel. FanDuel's just a small company around the corner, and it's been around for maybe 8-9 years, and it's grown massively. Before I was a contractor. And for financial services, I sold out to the man. And for a while, I had a job at Lloyd's as an engineering chapter lead. And what that meant was I was in meetings all the time. and I didn't really like it that much, but it's fine. It was good in some ways because I learned a lot of processes and governance and what to do, what not to do, and a lot of the problems that could be solved not by tech, but with the, through working with the teams or by understanding some of the processes and why they exist rather than just saying, oh, it's all red tape. Anyways, financial services. And then before that, I had a company, and we used to do it was contracts for small to medium companies. So we would do, it was just your tech shop for everything. So we started doing, when I started, it was like websites, apps, and that type of thing. And then by the end, we had some clients that, Speedo, Endura, Cycling Gear. We had some distilleries, Edinburgh Beer Factory, etc. There's a lot of good things there, but there are some old school practices that maybe need to improve. So for example, you might have times when only one team can test in an environment. So you might have set environments. You might have like a dev, integration, a sit environment, and a non-functional testing environment. And what happens is, if there is a team, if team one is testing their service, nobody else can use it. If you go and change the data, you change the return value from 99 to 99.1 or whatever, 98, the tests will break. So you don't want that. And then that stops the release. And then that causes a lot of huge backlog and massive retros of, oh, what went wrong? Why did we make a mistake? Actually, no, it's because we share an environment. We can't just spin it up. And anyways, so it can be quite painful. So that leads us to environment paranoia. So we are scared of pushing our code into an environment to test it. We don't want to do it. So then what happens is we end up with like huge releases because we want to test that everything works so that we look good. Or maybe not, maybe so that things work. Anyway, testing windows, deployment windows, and merge queues start to appear. So you might find a Slack channel that is, web app merge queue. And then people are saying, I'm just going to deploy this. And then they hope that everyone read it. And then they go and deploy it. And it can be, I've seen that before. So basically, this causes logistical nightmares. You can't just run the code. The organizational complexity means that someone somewhere might have not heard that you're testing your stuff, and they will change the data. Anyways, the next one is, it was perfect. The next one was perfect. So the first two, basically in this one, is the same at the beginning. You commit your changes, you push them to Git, then you have a build pipeline. But instead of shoving your app over the wall to an environment, what you might end up with is a containerized stack. So you might have a Docker Compose, or if you use Kubernetes or whatever it is. You spin up that stack, and then you run your integration tests against that in the build pipeline, in the environment, right? So let's say you have one or two services that you rely on that your team works with. Cool, you just check what the latest version is. But what if you are relying on 25 services from 4 different teams? I'm getting ahead of myself, but that causes versioning hell because you don't know what the latest version is. And I wouldn't necessarily use the latest tag if you're using containers, by the way. But anyways, but that causes a lot of issues because you might have, times when a team is updating their code and pushing a new version, and you don't know about it, and you're testing your code, and you still deploy it, thinking that it's all fine, but that team is making changes at the same time as you, and it's broken, right? So that might cause issues. So the difference is that you might have a deployment pipeline, you might run health checks, and you might run the app after that. It's more robust than the previous one, but it still has some risks, race conditions, etc. Anyways, so the issue here is, so it will be more expensive if you are spinning up a stack every time you run a build. If you're in a big team, you're running builds hundreds, if not thousands of times a day. And if you have 100 services, you're spinning that up every single time someone pushes code to a branch. Or if you have a Dependabot that automates your dependency updates, that will kick off a ton of builds. So it'll get expensive fast. So the builds might become slower because you're dealing with containers, so you're spinning up the containers. You're running the stuff, and then you're hopefully cleaning that up. Version management hell, which is what I spoke about, and the logistical complexity of any organization, which the logistical complexity goes from the previous one where it's using the test environment to now the complexities and the releases. So you're talking about, what version are we releasing? Does that work with this one? Have we tested against that version that team in the other side of the world built? So releases become a lot harder. So before it was testing, now it's releases. And what we want to do is get code out the door and working software as a measure of progress. Last one is, I tried. And it starts almost the same. And this is where I'm starting to get to contract testing, right? So I'm giving you all the everything around it. So you still push your code to Git, webhook, you kick off the pipeline. But now, instead of spinning up a stack of services, you don't do it. You use mocks. So you mock all the, and that sounds risky, doesn't it? But instead of having a container with the app that someone else built, you only have a mock of the response of that service. So if you're expecting a JSON response with a specific shape, you say, this is what I'm going to use for my tests. And what that does is it makes your tests run as fast as your unit tests because you're just doing it in memory. You run against the mock. But the race case, how do you even know if that is valid? Before it was version management hell. Now you have mocks everywhere. What are you going to do? Anyways, I'll get to that. So in this example, you might have that. And what we do is we actually check. We have a step to validate if that mock is still valid, if the provider of the application, the service that you consume is still providing that shape. And then if we validate that, if there is a way, if there was only a way to validate that that's still good, we kick off the deployment. And in the deployment, you might check if you can deploy. Is the version that I'm trying to deploy to this environment going to be fine based on the versions of the other services? So that is part of what I'm going to talk about. You might deploy the app after that if it goes well. Otherwise, you might just go and talk to the teams because the API is broken. You might record the deployment after you push the code, if everything's well. And you might record a release, depending on how you deal with your release cycles, because a deployment is not a release. Anyway, so the speed of the builds is going to be better. So the test will run quicker. You don't need to keep up with the dependency versions. You have a tool that does that for you. It will be reliable. So they will be as reliable as running the application if you do it the right way and if everyone else is using this. And it will be cheaper. You might save a ton of cash because you're only running against, you're not spinning up the stack, you're spending less time on builds. Builds get expensive fast. Providers need to have a mechanism to verify contracts. So what that means is, the providers, the services that you're consuming, the teams that are working on them, they need to be able to verify that the mocks are still valid. So that requires a little bit of work, talking to people, explaining how this works, etc. Requires a broker, which needs maintenance, and the broker, or you can pay for it. Well, it depends what you want to do. But basically, a broker is where you would store the check, the contract, whether the JSON response is still valid or not in an example that we had. And learning. Contract testing is not like integration tests. You might use the same tools, Jest or Supertest or something, but there will be a little bit of a learning curve as teams actually get used to the idea of the consumer-driven contract tests, which is what I'm going to talk about. So contract testing is a technique for testing an integration point by checking each application in isolation to ensure that the messages it sends or receives conform to a shared understanding that is documented in a contract. I took that from the docs. It's great. So basically, contract testing is not meant to be used to test the functionality of the stuff. That's your integration tests. But it's meant to be used to validate the shape of the responses of the consumers and providers. So basically, the terminology, I'm talking about consumers and providers. The consumer in our case, in our example, was the web app, let's say, and then you have an API that is the provider. So consumer consumes the provider. You might have a contract that's stored in a broker. And basically, the way it works is in your pipeline, you're running a type of unit tests called contract tests. And you say, this is, as a consumer, so let's say the web app, you might write some tests that say, this is the shape of the response that I'm expecting from the API. And you take that contract and you publish it to the broker. So that is what you're saying. So the consumer will always say, this is what I'm expecting. Then it would, in consumer-driven contract testing, you would need to go and verify. So you might need to go to add a step to your build pipeline to kick off the provider's verification process to make sure that that's still compliant. What is the latest version? So you didn't have to deal with versions. You didn't have to deal with anything. It's basically dependency in version in terms of architecture. So you point two things depend on each other to a third one, if I explain that properly. And then the provider, so let's say you're developing the API. You're the API team. If you are making changes to the API, you want to make sure that you know what breaks, if it breaks, or that everything's fine. So you have the steps that you have in your pipeline to verify the contract you would still have in your provider as part of build pipeline. So for example, if your service is consumed, and I've seen this at FanDuel, if your service is consumed by like 30 different services, if it's very stable, then what you might break one. You know, it's almost impossible to find all of this manually or by just doing normal integration tests or talking to 25 days would be ridiculous. So actually, you want to make sure that you check that you're still meeting the contracts so that all your consumers will still work. So it moves the responsibility for making sure that the APIs that people consume work to the teams that are building those APIs, which makes sense. Anyways, so basically it's similar. So you unit test the behavior of the application against the mock. You then grab the interactions between the two systems using the mocks, and you shove it into a contract that then you publish to the broker. So then what you want to do, yeah, you can read that. I'm not going to read it for you. So. Anyways, so types of contract tests. So the type of contract test that I explained, that is consumer driven. So the consumer is the one that defines what is expecting, and they'll kick off the provider's verification. But there's another type of contract test, which is a lot simpler. So instead of trying to ask everyone in your company that is building an API to make, add something to their pipeline, if there is 5,000 repos, getting people to add something to the pipeline, it will be expensive, you will interrupt them, etc. So what you could do is ask them to do something like, can you publish your Swagger file? Can you publish your Open API spec somewhere? So if the providers publish something like a Swagger file to the broker, then you don't need to actually kick off the verification process, but you would have the consumer check whether it still meets the expectation. Basically, you check the contract from the consumer against the Open API of the provider. Then you don't need to be checking everything, as long as the Open API spec was generated automatically or is reliable. So that is the only caveat. So we've been trialing that actually at work. And it's been working quite well because then you don't have to, teams actually generate those documents. You just store them in S3 or something. So instead of going and ask them to add something to pipeline, we just go and maybe tweak something to publish those contracts up into Pact Broker. And then we just check the consumers. So Can I Deploy is a tool, actually. So I'll just briefly touch on it. I'm not going to go too much into it, but is what I mentioned before. With the contracts, so you would be able to then say, when you record a deployment to an environment, with Can I Deploy, you can check if the versions that you need from all the services or the contracts are still being met, so in that environment, if that made sense. So basically, it checks for compatible versions in the environment that you're trying to push your code into. So I've been using this for a while, and it's very simple. So where you had all this complexity with releases, with Can I Deploy, you go check, it's fine, yeah, cool. You deploy your code, you release it, you record the deployment, otherwise you don't. It becomes a lot simpler, and you can actually do CI/CD in a bigger scale. And then live demo. So I might not do it live. What I might do is I'm going to go through some code, and I will explain bit by bit what it does. Can everyone see that? Hang on. I'm just going to do this. I'll just make it really big, because otherwise I can't see. So I just need a drink. Hold on a second. Thank you. I should have brought water. Oh well. Yeah, I can go even bigger. So basically, what I have here. What I have here is So basically, I spent some time looking at the demo. There's a 5-minute demo, the 5-minute, thing that you can do in Pact, where it takes you through how to set it up. It takes 5 minutes. It's not that tricky. I took that and I created a version for today. So what we have is a Node.js, your standard Node.js project. I'm using TypeScript. I'm using Node 18, I think. Yep. And basically, what we have is we have a couple of scripts here to run. I'm using Jest to run my tests, and I have 2 scripts. One is going to check. It is going to run some consumer tests. I'll have 2 folders in the source folder, and what I'll do is it will run some tests using mocks, unit tests, and then it will it will generate a contract. So I'll show you that. And then the provider, what I will do is it will run the expectations from that. That will be the provider verification step in the provider. If we had 2 different projects, I have one here. And that will, there's an option to publish or verify these contracts. So let's start. So basically, the consumer is not even a proper app. It's actually, I have a client. All that's doing, it takes a port number, and you'll see why later. This is part of the example that they had in the repo. Excuse me. And what we're doing with SuperAgent is intercepting that URL with the port number. And then we are getting the response in the body, which is an array. And what we're doing is we're basically just, I could have used a reduce here, but we're turning into an array of orders. What do orders look like? Orders look like this. So you have an ID, which is a string, and items is an array of items which have quantity and value, and ESLint errors. And then basically it will just return that, or it will log an error or throw an error. Is for an example, right? And then the consumer contract looks something like this. So with Jest, you can do this. So what we have here is a stub. So we just have, or a mock, we have some items. We have a matcher. What a matcher is, it will tell Pact. Pact is the tool that we're using for this. It will check that every item looks kind of like this. Every item in the array. So then what we're setting up here, we're setting up the provider expectations. So given that there are orders, and you can use any text that you want here, as long as it makes sense, when you receive a request for orders, with this request, so you have a method, when you get a get request in your provider, with this path, you could actually have matchers here. If you have query strings or anything else, you could match for query strings for different interactions that you have between the 2 systems. And then you can actually have different responses with matchers. So that will make sure that when you're running your tests, it will check if those things got called, and it will record those in a contract. And the way we set it up, and this is the way the tool works, so the provider, this thing that we set up here, that is, that sets up like a dummy, like a mock provider. If you've ever used knock, it's similar to knock. So it's just intercepting the requests and giving you responses. So I was going to use environment variables, but I ended up not doing it. So when you execute the test, you have an async function here that actually goes and calls the client fetch orders function. You pass the port, that's why. Hacky works, and then you return the assertion. So what I'm doing is, when I call the server with these parameters, I should get this response, and you're just verifying that works. So if we go and do that, consumer. So if we run the consumer contract test, we'll spin up the server, it will run it, and we can see that it worked. So the test passed. And what that does is it will create a file in Pact. And this is your contract. So your contract has a consumer name, and this is just saying this consumer is expecting that when you call the provider with these parameters is basically what we had in the test. This is what you will get. If these have matchers, then it will be a string, a number, and then whatever. You could, if you have different data types in the same field, which is not very nice, you would need 2 different interactions. You can match headers, so you can actually check, is it called with auth or not, if you're doing API, if you have authorization in your APIs. And these are the rules for matching the response. And this is what the expectation is. It'll be at 200 with that response code. And that is the consumer side of things. You can then publish that. And look at my Git commit here, 1, 2, 3. Anyways, so you can actually publish it, and this is my API key, which I'll regenerate after this, but it's just for the example. So usually we use at work, and for my projects I use the Git branches, the version, so that I can track where that is. And if it's in the main line, that to me means that it's ready to go. Anyways, so you can use the Pact broker CLI, and the Pact broker CLI is just a bunch of tools that allow you to make the calls to the Pact API, through the command line. So you can add this to your build pipeline. So I'm passing the branch name to be able to check whether any new branches meet the requirements or not. And the broker URL and the token, that's self-explanatory. So if we run that, publish to SH, that should run it, and it's a live demo, so it's not going to work. But what you should see is something like this. So what you would get is, I'll go to a different one. So I'm in demo mode. So what you would see is something like this, right? So if we had a consumer and a provider, you might have a consumer here in the main line, said, yep, this is successfully verified. Both things are in the main line. They are both compatible. And you can see the contract. So the consumer contract, these are the tests that we had in that jest file. So this is what you would have. So requested retrieval products, and the other one it was orders. With this, the server should respond with this and these headers, right? So you have your assertions here. And the provider contract, and this is what I was talking about in terms of bidirectional. With bidirectional, the provider in this case had already published a contract. So it had provided its open API spec. It provided a verification report, so how it was verified that that API spec was actually fine. So they tested it. And what happens is when the consumer publishes the contract, it will publish it to Pactflow or Pact. The verification will happen automatically, and then you can keep going with your build pipeline. Now let's look at the provider side. Before I keep going, I'm just talking loads. Any questions or anything that is not clear? Yes.
I didn't see most of it, but I can visualize it in my mind.
Cool.
The one thing I didn't get was, do you need to write specific tests to test the contract, or does it somehow from your mock test that you have anyway and capture?
Sorry.
The question is, from your mock test, does it capture the request and response that you've mocked automatically, and therefore you don't need to do any extra work from your usual tests, or do you need to write specific contract tests to, which would double up, I suppose, on the test you would build anyway? So I wasn't clear on that.
Question, actually, because no, I have a
good one.
Yeah. So that's a good question. So basically, I would have the contract tests as a different suite of tests, because what you're doing is not. So you have unit tests, integration tests, or whatever else you have to make sure that the thing works properly. This is just contract tests are to be used to validate that the mocks that you're using for those tests are valid, so that they match what the provider was going to give you.
Yeah.
So it's purely for that one purpose. So contract testing, I would have a different suite just to make sure that, to validate the mocks. That's what it comes down to.
But you would use the same mock source files, or
Yeah.
otherwise you don't know it's going to be the same stuff?
Yeah, exactly. So I would have those source files, and then I would run the test against those
Okay, that makes sense.
those fixtures, right?
I need to build it in a way that it just intercepts your request response from all integration tests. And that's what basically.
Yes. So actually, there is I don't know if you guys have used Cypress. Cypress for front-end testing. So there's a tool, Pact Cypress or something like that, that you can add your fixtures, you can add all of that. It generates your contract test for you, so you don't have to do anything. If you use Pact Cypress or whatever, I don't know what it's called, but it's pretty slick, because then you don't need an extra suite of tests. You could run them as part of it, and it generates your contracts. So I think the framework is extensible. So there are people developing these things, so you don't have to have an extra suite of tests. The only thing that you will need to handle manually would be, or separately, would be publishing the contract to the broker. But that you could do in CI, you would have the file, and then you do something with it, like the test reports, you might publish them somewhere anyways. So that's a good question.
Nice, thank you.
Anyone else on the consumer side or anything? Yep.
I've actually used Pact at like a previous company, and the problem we had was broker instability can become like a huge problem, right? And like it's like a massive dependency that exists within your CI/CD pipeline or whatever. And if it's related to, like, say you use some like networking or whatever, like maybe we configured it correctly. But do you have like a flag inside your CI/CD pipelines which is just like skipped Pact, just like go back to the absolute bare minimum? Because we found that like when the Pact broker was inconsistent, it like was the cause of the biggest incident I've ever seen in my entire career. And so like I'm just like scared about introducing like such a dependency within my CI/CD pipeline. And have you thought about it a similar way? Have you noticed this? Yeah.
So it's a single point of failure in your CI/CD. Before you had a ton of them, at least now it's central.
Yeah.
Which is not really good either, but it's a trade-off, right? So I think if you want to, so my answer will be, in order to come up with the best solution, it's necessary to understand where the complexity lies in your ecosystem. So if the complexity is in the organization, you might benefit from something like Pact. But if you're a smaller company that doesn't have so much, you might not, or you might be able to get away with it because there's not thousands of requests going every second minute or whatever. So I think it really depends. Now, I used the open source broker a long time ago. And that was flakier than the cloud version. Yeah. So we got the cloud version, and that seems to work quite well.
I'd say we had two problems with it. One was that problem, another one was generating the producer, which the OpenAI plugin solves. Anyone that might take away from this is use the OpenAI Swagger generation thing.
Absolutely. Okay. So I would say if you can, use just what Rory said. Try to do bidirectional. If you have a way to validate your OpenAPI spec, I would rather use that, because then you don't have to ask teams to change the way they do things already. You just take the file and publish it as long as it is verified. So if it's manually created, I wouldn't use it. I would rather have a provider verification test. Cool. Let's move. So let me see. So provider. Here's one I made earlier. So provider. So the provider, I have a bunch of data with ESLint issues because I was doing something in my editor, something weird. Anyways, and this is what Toby mentioned there. So if you're going to run tests, run them against, use the same mocks, use the same fixture files. The provider in this case is an Express server. So we're just setting it up. We're setting up cores and your usual stuff. Body parser to deal with JSON responses. We're setting up a header. Right? If you think about the consumer contract, it was expecting that header with the character set, etc. And it's adding an endpoint that returns the demo data. That's very complex. It's great. And then we have a test. And this is a chunky one. So this is the provider verification. You would need to do something like this. There's a simpler way of doing it, which I think they need to update in their repo, using the Docker container, and just use the CLI to do a lot of this config and environment variables. But anyways, so this is setting up the provider verification. So the provider name, we'll get it from the same configuration file that we used for the consumer in this case. So whatever your service is called, you would need to set it up there in the configuration for the provider. Same with the base URL. This is basically what we're going to run against. Pact has logging. I usually don't really care too much about that unless I'm debugging tests. Environment variables that I would take are so the Git branch that we're using for the version, the commit, the broker URL, which is what Rory mentioned there, and a token, an API token to do it. And then all this is doing is configuring where to send the verification results and what to send. So it will basically, there you go. So it'll spin up the server. Excuse me. So that is doing that before each test in this case. And after each test, it will get rid of the app. It will close the Express server. And then this is your test. So think about all of that setup. That's crazy. I would split that anyways. So should validate the expectations from order web, which is your consumer. So it will return, basically it's just saying, verify the provider using all of these things. There is a path here where you're given it the Pact file. Where is it? So you can actually check the consumer. So what this is doing actually, let me explain it properly. So what this will do is if you have the settings, like if you were in CI or something like that, or you would go to the broker, you would check what contracts there are for your service, and it will verify that the provider is still meeting those requirements. That's what it would do. And then you can publish that verification result, or you could choose not to, right? If you're, let's say you're adding a new service and you don't want the provider to break, you might add a development flag, and then with the provider you might have checks to avoid work in progress pacts. So that the provider is quite simple. It doesn't need a lot of stuff. It just needs to validate that it is still meeting the expectations from the consumers. That's what it comes down to. And then run the provider contract tests, similar. So it'll just use jest, it will do all of that. And it will check whether that is still valid, and it will, this is the expectation. So request for orders, given their orders, returns the response with 200, which is the same assertions that we saw in the consumer with its headers and has the matching body. And you can publish that. And ultimately, you will end up with publishing the contracts to Pactflow. In this example, you would get something like this. If the pact was not met, if your provider is basically breaking all the consumers, what would happen is you would find something like this. And this is not bidirectional, so you wouldn't really know a lot. You might need to go and take a look at the interactions and then debug manually. So the bidirectional contract tests are the way to go. So the difference is, if it's failing, you could come here and it will tell you this is what's failing. So it tells you, the interactions and the response body. The ID actually is incompatible in the response body. So this is a bidirectional, gives you a lot more context. And then I'm just going to take ages doing this. Hang on. And then I'm just going to ask any questions anymore.
Well, first, thank you very much for that. The thing that I like about talks like this is that you obviously work with quite a big organisation, but there's quite a lot of lessons that people working for smaller startups or getting things off the ground with quite small teams can learn. So even if you aren't using the full set of tools, you can think conceptually, what problems were they trying to solve there? What are we running into that's similar? Maybe you've got a mobile app and a web app, and maybe there's a couple of you, but actually you still need to coordinate. And
to make sure that the response from the provider is correct, right? It doesn't matter, even if the provider is developed by somebody else, right?
Yep.
That we don't even know. Sorry.
That's fine, thank you.
cool. Okay, so let's go with Orkan first, and then Toby again.
Yeah, I have actually two questions. One of them, how you handle responses with like non-JSON responses,
Non-JSON responses?
like a static files, images or whatever.
Let me think. I wouldn't necessarily. So I think this is meant to validate requests and responses in specific formats. So you have JSON responses. I think you can validate HTML, I'm not completely sure, or XML. You can actually use Pact with GraphQL or message queues. So Redis, Nats, MQTT, all of RabbitMQ, all of that stuff as well. You can use that. I haven't looked at a case where I would use it with images, because usually an image I would treat as a static file that I would serve through blob storage, for example, and I would just store the metadata in a service that tells me where that is. So I wouldn't necessarily check the image or the stream of information. Rather, I would check that the metadata actually matches the shape that I'm expecting. So I wouldn't necessarily, but I don't know your use case there. I wouldn't necessarily use this for static files, for example. But there are other formats that you could do. Yep.
And is that possible to handle something like response like streams or WebSockets or?
I believe so, because the data would still need to come in a format, right? So you need to have as part of your tests, you need to validate that the mocked information.
So it's not just a response as a return the JSON from the function.
Yeah, it could be something else, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just a quick one. I'm not sure if I completely understood what you just said, Diego. Just want to clarify. So obviously you test against the contracts. There's an open API spec which is generated. It doesn't necessarily mean that that service will necessarily respond that, right? There might be actually some business logic issue within the service. Were you also saying that those request response pairs can then be used by the service to then say, oh, all these consumers want to, have created all these request responses. I can actually test whether our service is really producing those or not, to really verify that not only the spec is correct, but also the business logic in the service is correct. Did you say that?
Yep. So I can show you a bit in the code actually. So if we look at this fixture here, let's say that a service only needs the name. Let's say one of the consumers only needs to know the name and it doesn't have any other requirements. The contract test from the consumer would only have the name as a requirement. So if the provider then decided to deprecate the quantity field and there are no consumers, they could safely make that breaking change, which I wouldn't recommend either. I think there are other things you can do. But basically, consumers will, in many cases, not need every field in the response. So you should only create a contract based on the things that you need, not everything else, so that if the provider wants to make a change, they would know what actually broke.
I was thinking more about the business logic. Let's have a more complex example of upgrade a client and very complex business logic to make that happen, changing data, etc. And maybe different parameters being provided in order to achieve that. So would they be able to get the request or response pairs that other clients want to use and then say, well, actually, we should run those against our business logic to see whether this is actually really going to respond with what they expect that it would respond. So it's both validating the contract, and if teams want to do that, the service teams can then actually validate that their business logic also does the right thing.
So I would say that to me comes down to the requirements for the provider. If you're working with a team, the requirements should come from business. You have three amigos, all of that should, right? Or at least you should have a conversation to set the acceptance criteria of every feature that you release. Should. It doesn't always happen, but it should. I hate Jira, but I love doing some of the refinement. Don't love refinement, but you get it. Like is necessary, because then you can write integration tests to test that functionality, and then contract tests would only be used to check that the response request pairs are met, but the functionality and business logic is not tested through contracts, it's tested through integration tests. So you would have mocks for all of these scenarios, right? And you would validate those mocks that then you use in your integration test to validate all the business logic. What teams consume what endpoints with what shape, that might not be necessarily what you know as a provider. You just know that you're providing this service. How it is consumed, you don't really know. So that is the responsibility of the consumer, and they are saying, this is what we expect. When we send this GET request with these query parameters, that's the response shape that we are. So yeah, so it's a bit of splitting where the definition of done and the acceptance criteria is, who owns it.
Cool. On that note, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we'll have a little 5-minute conversation with Alan, who's currently behind the cameras. But we're going to try a little kind of intro for what he does and some chat about some of the ways that he uses technology. That's just a short little 10-minute conversation. So if you want to use the bathroom or grab an extra drink, we'll be back in literally 5 minutes.
do I have it open? Yes, I do. Right, I've got it open. Right. So this should take you to a recipe, right? So you would think maybe like a recipe site. This is like one of these things that you kind of do as like a. It's an easy thing. Like if you're doing like a little demo project or something like this. Like how hard is the recipe? Right. What's the recipe got? It's got ingredients. It's got a method. Straightforward, right? But how do you implement this, right? What is it you do to actually make this happen? And if you've got someone who's non-technical inputting the recipes, and you want to do cool things with the method here, you want to say, I want to prep this in 10 to 20 minutes, and you want to have that formatted nice, and you want to have bullet points, but maybe the method stops in the middle because you need to do something random and it starts again a bit later on. Maybe you want to be able to mark up, we're going to be able to hold this in the fridge for 1 week, and again, we want like a nice little icon and stuff like this. How do you do that? Oh, right. Early, I absolutely welcome the audience participation.
Question, do you need a content management system?
Yes, of sorts, yeah, exactly, yeah. So I'm doing the dev, and my partner's doing the actually inputting the recipes and doing all of this kind of stuff. Sorry, and I've missed a big part of this. So this is for people who are doing vegan meal planning and recipe prep and stuff like this. So if you're a vegan in the room, this is a vegan recipe. I'm not vegan, disclaimer, but this is a vegan recipe set. So my go-to was, of course, XML, right? That's the right thing, okay? Isn't it? No? So what we got here, we got a document, right? Kind of, like XML is all about documents, right? We decided that, that's what we use. And I know that people hate XML because I think, my really well-planned presentation here.
Can I ask, why would you not just use HTML and CSS?
Partner doesn't know
Maybe
HTML.
Markdown.
Partner doesn't know HTML and CSS, so
Okay.
I'm not going to expect them to start, throwing that into an open text form or something like this, or editing the page.
You probably already have a template, and so then you could maybe just use Markdown.
I could, yeah. So that is one potential answer. But I kind of wanted to do, so I did think about Markdown, and originally this did use Markdown right at the beginning. But then I wanted to start adding things like I wanted to be able to tag a piece of text. I wanted to say, right, you've got a duration, or you want to link to another recipe, and you want to add that in. How do you do that with Markdown? And adding syntax to Markdown is a nightmare. So I started using regex, and no, that's not going to work. So I didn't do that. So yeah, I went with XML. And people hate XML because, we went from documents to, okay, we're going to start using it for images, because images are kind of like documents, right? And that's not so bad, but then we started using it for MathML, and I think that's when we went way off piece, and people were like, we absolutely hate XML, don't want to do anything with it anymore, we're just going to use JSON. If the content is mainly text, and you just want to annotate it, and you want to do it in a way that you can teach someone are you going to add a text, you're going to do a few bits and pieces to it, but you don't want to have to implement a whole lot of code. Again, how would you guys do this? So what this looks like in the back end, if we're editing a recipe, this is what you do. You say, we've got a recipe.
Could you make it a bit larger, please?
Could I make it a bit larger? In theory, I can make this larger, can't I? Yes, I can make it larger. So we have a recipe. What does the recipe consist of? It consists of methods, and there are steps, and there are some details. And I'm not showing you everything here, but we might want to add some details at the beginning, and we annotated only, this is kind of a bad example, but anyway, we want to annotate a quantity here, and we want to annotate how long this can be frozen for, stuff like this. Okay. Again, what would be the fastest solution for this? So I think one of the things is I find that sometimes I'm sure there is a JavaScripty way of doing this, but sometimes people sort of throw out the baby with the bathwater, and they have such bad experiences with XML and stuff like this. They're like, I hate this. So anyway, how does this turn into this? Can anyone guess? Yes! Oh, yes. That's in the talk title, isn't it? Okay, there we go. Show of hands. who has heard of XSLT? Ah, that's all right. There's like 6 people in here who have. Hmm?
Who's coded it?
Who's coded it? 3 people. Wow. OK, so XSLT is XML itself, and it is a declarative way of essentially, so XPath. I think maybe more people have heard of XPath. Show of hands for XPath. OK, right, OK. So I'm going to show you what XSLT looks like, and it is going to hurt your eyes. But essentially, this is a template. It's written in XML. And what we're doing in various parts here is we're saying when we've got a tag, like a recipe, we want to throw in, this is what we want the HTML to look like. If we have a tag, and this is not good XSLT, and I'll get to that in a second. It does look a little bit horrific, but say I want to add a new tag, right? I don't need to implement a regular expression, I don't need to do anything like that. All I want to say is, all right, I want to add a tag which implements seconds, and this is what the HTML is going to look like. I can actually write this pretty quickly because basically I'm just templating each of the little sections here. And make that bigger. Could a V-code person tell me how I do this? Command 5. Ooh. Too much? Too much XML. Less XML. OK. There's some horrific things in here because I've got a real bugbear when you see a fraction online and it's not an actual fraction glyph, and it's, you know, I don't like that stuff. So there's some really weird stuff in here. But essentially, this text here, I'm going to scroll up and down it really quickly so you can see how much there is. This is what turns this. And these are the tags which I've implemented here. So this is like my own kind of private HTML language, and that's what it turns into this. There is a way of, the browsers are now actually stripping this out. You can actually just deliver the straight XML if you wanted to the browser and say there's an XSLT style sheet to format it, and the browser will do it itself entirely. People have kind of forgotten that this is implemented to such an extent that Chrome is now removing it, I think. So it's not going to be around for very much longer. So the way of doing this now is, right now I do this in the back end. So server-side in Rails, that will take the XML and it will convert it to the right HTML. You can do it browser-side now using a library called Saxon.js, which is what the talk was originally going to be about, if I'd prepared it properly, which is using a JavaScript library to convert the XML into the right HTML. And the reason that some of the XSLT for the XSLT pros in the room is not very nice is because I'm using an early version of it because people decided that it is a rubbish technology. We didn't want to implement it anymore, and the libraries haven't been updated for ages and ages. I rambled enough now. So my question to you guys is, how would you guys do it?
Markdown with front matter and a static site generator. Hugo, Jekyll, Hexo, 52 others. Something like Netlify for deployment.
Okay.
But if you need interactive pieces, you probably have to do your own deployment and add endpoints that are interactive on top of otherwise a static site generator site. But Markdown is perfect for that. Front matter is perfect for most of the variables, but not things like 1 week and 6 months. They're inline text.
Yeah.
But you'd probably pick those out of your text using something horrible like jQuery.
But there's another library allow you to add a React component in Markdown now. So I don't remember the name of the library, but yeah, with front matter is actually, and they do some parsing when you build.
Very sophisticated.
Yeah, what's it called? I don't remember. But yeah.
So that is adding tags to Markdown, essentially.
React components. Yeah, it's basically what you did with your templates.
MDX, yeah.
What's it called?
MDX?
Yeah.
MDX,
yeah, that's right.
Any other takers?
Oh,
thank you.
Sure. So the the XML that you're creating there is obviously really good because of the schema structure, right? So the weeks is the classic example, which a friend over here pointed out, that you can just inline weeks into the whatever the tag was, the enclosing tag, and then the SSLT will just handle that. Most people, I think today, accept that those are kind of edge cases, and that kind of level of schema is relatively unnecessary. You can handle that with other methods. So the reason why people go for things like JSON and things like that is that it's relatively less structured. It makes that problem more complicated, but the trade-off is that it makes the kind of the general case easier. So you end up with a kind of easier structure that's more flexible with the problem of how do you handle these kind of nested edge cases. And to do that, then I would say React server-side rendering would be the standard way that people would do that today.
But when you're talking about JSON there, for the user in this case to be actually editing JSON in a text field like that?
Oh no, I imagine that you could just write something that would allow the user to WYSIWYG and convert it to JSON.
Yeah, so that was one of the things I was wondering, because what I kind of wanted was like a domain-specific language for writing recipes. So Markdown would be like a solution for that, that was relatively sophisticated that you could learn, but wasn't something that was like you would get really messed up with the syntax and would be like super complicated to pick out. And also that I didn't need to write a bunch of front-end code to implement. So that was kind of where I went with this. So if you had JSON, then you would need to write like components, and you kind of go in that kind of direction, both the writing and the reading.
I think it's hard to argue that the writing of XML is fundamentally simpler than the writing of JSON. I think you're going to struggle to make that case. Sure, you can definitely write this in XML, and you can definitely write in JSON, and both are reasonable alternatives, and there's nothing wrong with this, of course. But it's a stretch to say, because I don't want to write a WYSIWYG editor, therefore XML. That seems like an odd choice.
No, well, okay, so there was a wee bit of that, but the interesting thing between writing JSON and writing XML. So I would just agree with that in terms of you're going to give someone a free-form text field, and like you're going to give someone like a quick tutorial about how you enter stuff in it. I know technically XML can be very specific about various things, but actually it's actually a bit more kind of okay than it kind of looks in terms of like it's a bit more accepting of bad syntax.
And it has comments.
Yeah, true. Yeah, so in case the mic didn't pick it up, XML has comments, which is good.
But the other thing is, in terms of the structure, this is mainly text with annotation, and JSON is...
Yeah, I mean,
I feel like we're 2023 and we're arguing about JSON and XML.
I feel like we're each on a tiny, tiny hill and defending it to the death. And I'll stop talking in just a moment. But yeah, so the question then between our two tiny hills that we're going to die on here is schema validation, right? So XML, it's super easy for you to validate that the XML that you've written is good. I can write any odd nonsense in JSON. Of course I can, because it's JSON. It's JavaScript. Any odd nonsense is what JavaScript is for. But you can validate JSON to a schema. It's not that hard. There are lots of tools out there that do it. You know. Anyway, I'll shut up now.
No, but just hang on with the mic for 1 second. So there's a bunch of tooling that was developed around XML, which is one of the things that I kind of feel like it's the baby out with the bathwater. So you have schemas, you have XML style sheets for transformation and all the rest of it. And the weird thing is, I haven't really seen JSON catch up with that. Like I've seen implementations, like in theory, it exists. JSON style, there is an implementation for that, but people don't use it. So I wonder if it's an inherent strength of the data of what it is that you don't need it, or have people just forgotten that these approaches existed?
It's a different approach. Right? You get JQ for JSON manipulation. It's really like a C++ library. You transpile it for use in V8 or whatever.
Hi there. Minor technical claim to fame. My brother wrote the fastest XSLT parser in the world when I actually went on to go to work for Intel to put the instruction sets into their chips before it sort of faded away as a technology.
Do those instruction sets still exist?
I believe they do, yeah. Amazing. I'd have to ask him. But yeah, that was a long time ago.
So it's got hardware acceleration.
It's got hardware acceleration, yeah.
Right, okay.
But to go back to one of the points that was mentioned about if you were to step back a little bit and provide a WYSIWYG editor, probably one of the things to look at would be something like ProseMirror, which doesn't use content editable, which a lot of the earlier ones did, which is basically editing HTML, but has an abstract tree underneath it, which basically is block level, so it has like the concept of sentences, and part of its interface is it allows you to put blocks into it, or markers. Okay. Which would allow you to do things like weeks and stuff like that. And then that becomes part of the interface. So you just swipe something and say, oh, that's a week, or this is an ingredient, or something like that. And then that's encoded into the abstract tree, which you could then parse directly out and provide HTML with. Might be an interesting route.
Yeah, awesome. I'll check that out. Jamie's like, shut up now about the XML.
Cool. Well, I mean, have you got much more to say in your thing?
Saying this, no. Well, it was just one very brief thing. So if you are a vegan, you're interested in vegan meal planning and recipes and all the rest of it, obviously check out this and the recipe.
What's the name of the business?
It's New Norm Food. Unfortunately, I know if you go to the front page and you go sign up, you're not going to receive the registration email because I've broken something. So the easier way to sign up, and I'll give you like.
Framework for integration testing.
Yeah, look, I'm not a software engineer anymore. I'm a coder and a cowboy. That's it. However, if you're interested, I can set you up with a subscription to all of the content on the site. There's a ton of content. There's loads of recipes and stuff. Just hit me up on Twitter or email me.
Cool. So firstly, thank you, Alan. I think one of the reasons that I wanted to do something like that is that it provokes a little bit of debate. And I think sometimes you get a technical talk and you get people go, oh, how would you use it for this, this, and this? But it's actually, a lot of technology choices come from a little bit of an argument. Oh, we should use this, we should use that. It's good for this, it's good for that. And actually drilling down into what the technology does, what is good for, how easy it is to the user, and how easy it is to implement. So I just wanted to get like a little 10-minute thing back and forth, because those are the type of conversations that we should be having when we're designing product systems or whatever it is that we're building. Cool, so that's it for this evening. Next month, which I will remember the date, we are going to be back here. So this is our new venue, kind of full time. It's March the 23rd, which is Thursday, as normal. I think we should be confirming Glenn and either Tom or Alec, depending on which presentation gets done first. So please do come back for that. Check us out on Twitter. We'll announce it there, on Meetup. And also, I've started a little Discord. You can find that at scottishtechnology.club. I have made a pledge to, if anybody asks me questions, spend like an hour a week answering kind of, JavaScript questions, technology questions, or maybe freelance career questions, whatever you want, message me. I know some other people have volunteered to do that as well, so if you're looking for some sort of help with your career or with your code, shout me a message and I'll try and connect you with the right person. And on that note, thank you for coming along and see you next month.